suoraan. Annatko joku merkin mulle? Odotan tuohon minuutin vielä. Okay. All right, it's time. So, welcome to our two-part panel on civil-military relations. My name is Jonna Alava. I'm a PhD student at University of Helsinki and a researcher here at the National Defence University in our Russia research group. And in my dissertation project, I have studied the military patriotic education in Russia, and how the state legitimized, for example, Yun Armia, this kind of military patriotic youth organization, and I have also studied gender aspects through representations of women soldiers, and lately how patriotic education changed in schools to support the war against Ukraine. And when I started my dissertation, I hadn't heard about civil-military relations, but on the way I have understood how my research also contributes to this field. And Russia's weak success in the early stages of war surprised Western experts. It showed that images of the capabilities of Russian armed forces built up over the recent years were not true. It showed us that the assessment of military power is not only a matter of comparing technological and quantitative capabilities, but the results of warfare are influenced by many different societal factors as well. As Bettina Renz described in her keynote speech, there has been a gap in Western research about this issue. In other words, there is a gap in research on civil-military relations. It seems that the lesson has been learned now. There are a growing body of sociological research and projects which find ways to understand how non-material factors, such as military culture, society's values and attitudes, and assumptions related to leadership affect the construction of armed forces in Russia. For this upcoming work, we need more cooperation between military academies and civilian universities to create the creative approaches to these questions. This panel is a wonderful start for this cooperation on civil-military relations in Russia. So what are civil-military relations? I see that discipline can be roughly divided into two entities: a more traditional and narrow understanding of civil-military relations examines civilian control over the armed forces and vice versa, participation of military figures in politics, and how these relationships affect, for example, to effectiveness and autonomy of military. In larger approach, research on civil-military issues covers almost everything which is related to civil-military interface. We need to understand Russian society, economy, demography, history, technological development, and security, just to mention few aspects, and how all these affect the Russian military and warfare. In this panel, we have 3 presentations. I think we haven't reached Poni Paljak, so we have plenty of time to discuss about these topics. And civil-military relations is originally a Western idea, and the research about it is marginal in Russia. Still, it's very central to examine how Russians think about these issues, and especially how they are going to manage and develop them based on experiences in Ukraine. Our first panelist is Elisa Movtajeva from the National Defence University, who has studied the Russian understanding of civil-military concepts. I think this is a very important lesson, a starting point before we delve deeper into various topics we have today. Elisa will talk about how these concepts have developed in Russia and how they differ from Western ones. So, I will give you the floor to you, Elisa, please.
So, hello everybody, my name is Elisa, and this summer I knew nothing about civil-military relations, but then I started reading through different articles. I have graduated from University of Helsinki as a Master of Social Sciences, and this was a complete new topic for me, but quite interesting. So I'll start with some basics, ideas that cover civil-military relations in general and how they are understood in Russian discussions. The idea of civil-military relations covers the constant searching for right balance. The army should be controlled by civilians, but the civilians must remember that they can be overthrown because army has the weapons and autonomy and potential to destroy the whole hardly built balance. Here is a structure of my presentation. First, I introduced you what did we study and why, and terminology is especially important in our presentation because we use such approach that pays special attention to words and theories used. We'll take a look at historical context and answer on the question what differences there are in Russian civil-military approaches compared to military cultural approach also. The second one is a bit broader point of view, and it covers military cultural things. And I'll end up with some conclusions on this based on this topic. So this is a classic picture of civil-military balance. We have a civilian part and civilian leadership part, civilian society part, and military there also. And this is a picture of the balance that is the aim that we are searching for. And if we talk about Russia, we must remember that it is a kind of special case, but not completely, in a complete way. Russian civil-military relations are influenced by its Soviet and imperialist past, and we must keep this in mind. They also have a long tradition in state positioning itself as a great power. Russia is not completely a unique case, however, and there has happened and seen many other transitions from authoritarianism to democracy in other countries also. And there are even many positive examples from previous communist states. Russian forces had gone through many changes also, but reformers have failed to achieve all the goals. And it was about transition. One of those aims that were brought from civil military thinking was establishing a professional, democratically controlled army, but it didn't happen because transition turned backward to autocracy. Our main question, broader question, was how the Russian academic discourse covers the interaction between army and society. And although providing control over this army is the main task of a state, there are at least two approaches that I will introduce to you today as an idea of civil military objective control, and this is the classic Western idea introduced by Samuel Huntington in 1960s, and there is also a military cultural point of view that is quite opposite to the Western democratic one. Samuel Huntington is actually the father of civil military thinking. He had started his ideas in 1960s, and his first object was American society. He had noticed that there happened changes and army had to be modernized, and he introduced new way of thinking. He stated, for instance, that a successful transition to democratic civil-military relations successful transition to democratic civil-military relations require creating a objective civilian control. Subjective civilian control and objective civilian control are the opposite things. Subjective control is about when army is politicized, and this was the case and problem in Soviet Union. But if we move to democracy, if the transition did happen, we talk about objective control, and that was an idea that Samuel Huntington created. He first paid attention on American civil-military relations, but later he analyzed also other countries, and the Soviet Union was one of them. Here is the classic book on civil-military relations, and the author is this Huntington. Our research is based on the articles published in 1988 to 2023. We used concept analysis, and I took this book to this slide because these ideas are broadly introduced also in Russia in 1990s, although they were born in United States in 1960s. They came to Russia a bit later after the Soviet Union collapsed, and most of scholars start by introducing this objective theory created by Samuel Huntington. He also wrote another book, A Clash of Civilizations, that is related more to this second approach, military cultural, and it's a broader one. And some scholars mention also this Morris Yanovitz, but he is concerned about army's professionalization, and it is not so popular as first one, at least, because it covers a professionalization of army, and this is something that did not happen in Russia, especially. When we started looking at civil-military relations in Russia, first thing that stated out was the terminology. Russian used different words to refer to these phenomena, and we should be careful and pay attention on which words and in which way is used to cover the matter, because the classic definition гражданско-военные отношения means the classic definition, like in English, civil-military relations. It is usually referred to talk about objective democratic control, but it's not so popular as the second version. In Russian articles, the second term that appears a lot is военно-гражданские отношения, and here you see that the military part is first one, and that means that it is highlighted more, and this is traceable to the situation in 1990s when army was in chaos, and scholars were interested how to bring the balance back, and in their discussions the military seemed to be more important to be studied. Some scholars talk about broader interaction between civil society and army, and they talk more generously about взаимоотношения между армией и обществом. And there is also a good book on this matter written by Natalia Danilova. It covers civil-military relations in Russia, but it's written to make civil-military relations in Western world familiar to Russian scholars, but it also makes a comparison between Russian and Soviet-style systems and the Western one, and this is a great link between both worlds, and there are many interesting comparisons. Natalia also wrote that in 2007 the definitions were not established, and they were used in different ways in different contexts. In 2017 I have noticed a more established classic version of Russian abbreviation ГВ, or гражданско-военные отношения, and this is more like English term CMR abbreviation, I mean, and this was the oldest article, and there the whole abbreviation seemed to be more established and already familiar to the scholars. There is a problem when we talk about civil-military relations in Russian context, because it requires to make a definition also on the civil part. And what do we mean if we talk about civil society in Russian context, because there is no such one. And there is an abbreviation on the matter. Russians use a word, an abbreviation ГО, that means гражданское общество, but the Russian scholars as well as their Western colleagues end up somehow in a statement that there is no actually real civil society in Russian context, and as we talk about civil-military relations, the other parts, it's in a way it is always missing and weaker, and it is hard to find a definition for it. Levada was one of critics. He said that there is no civil society in Russia. It would have needed much more changes in society. It would have needed distribution of power, independent parliament, local authorities, and independent mass media. At least these are not all that is required to talk about civil society. So let's take a quick look on historical context. These theories were created in USA in 1960s by Samuel Huntington, but the reason why they came to Russia is because that matter was was not allowed to discuss at public until 1990s. And after that time, civil-military relations came to Russia. One of first sociologists that introduced the whole idea was Serebrennikov and Derugin, and they wrote a book on the matter. They placed civil-military relations thinking to a field of military sociology and described the civil control as a necessary for the transition from the totalitarianism to democracy. And they are quite optimistic about democracy. And that was quite surprising for me, because the things they wrote about were such modern and optimistic. And their analysis on Soviet period mistakes also seemed to be quite rational and well-based. They also talk about reorganization of civil-military relations. On the same lines was the father of civil-military thinking, Huntington. He wrote that civilian control in Russia in 1990s were even in better shape than ever in Soviet Union. And there was a civilian influence on army, better transparency, Duma's supervision, and some public debates over the matter on security and military issues also. It is ironic that later the great power thinking scholars will again turn to Samuel Huntington, but they will pick other theories created by him. They will look at civilization theory that highlights completely different way of thinking. These discussions go on 10 years later. Analysis of Soviet time mistakes go on in academic texts, and there were intentions to restore armies' situations, to improve its defense duties and capability to achieve also balance between army and society. I have told before previously in this presentation that army was in chaotic situations, and to improve that, scholars took a look on what Western colleagues did do to solve the problems. Comparing Russian civil-military relations go on in these texts, and they express some more things needed to go on, and one of those wishes was a wish for more transparency when dealing with security policy, because they thought that because too many common things are kept in secret, this damages the army and the state also, and more experts should be in these security discussions. But although the wishes were expressed, the old problems remained unsolved. And towards modern time, the last article was from 2017, and there was a statement that civil-military relations discussions about a successful transition to democracy, they diminished, and scholars did not get fundings, and the whole topic became unimportant. Although the expert continued stating that much more discussions are needed, and the old problems didn't pass away. And then we turn to military cultural terminology, and it's very opposite to the democratic social military thinking. The goal of military cultural approach is to create a unifying concept of military culture. Military culture is expressed in Russian language as военная культура общества, and they discuss in different contexts how the wars have shaped Russian society. And these studies began in 1990s at the same time as civil-military discussions, and they are broader. They take a broader cultural point of view, and one of key scholars to whom other scholars refer a lot is Valery Gribinkov. He stated that the military culture should be studied like any other political, economic, legal points of view, and it should be, the military cultural thinking should be harmonized, and that is the task that he gives to the field. Here are some points of view that military cultural way of thinking highlights, and the aim is to strengthen the history, to demonstrate how Russia have gradually militarized and how essential that was. But although these old theories remain a lot Soviet propaganda actually, there are some new elements. They discuss how the army can exist in modern consumer society, and in this context they mean the traditional understanding of army, and they somehow see it quite complicated that army should survive in modern consumer society and somehow become a provider of security services to the state. They also criticize a lot that the idea that soldier and army mustn't think about money, and that's the way the question of professionalization is put backward. They say that it's maybe too consumer society orientated thinking, and they want to create a link straight from within citizen and state, and that causes that professionalization thinking became less actual. Army in Soviet Union before 1990s was considered to be an educational organization for every citizen. It is believed that it is like a school for every man that should be gone through. New era of stabilization from a military cultural point of view. New era of stabilization took start from 2002, and from their point of view, this new ideologic direction is a good thing. It emphasizes the role of Orthodox Church, and it's considered that it deal with the whole task of unifying the whole state and citizens, and that's where this is a very fruitful ground for this civilization theory, because it pays special attention on Orthodox civilization as an unique and special one. There are also some points of view that study the military cultural approach more neutrally by describing key features of military culture: masculinity, totalitarianism, and duality, but there are also other ones. And in these texts, they are written not in a way that state that this should be done, but they describe more at the whole system, what it is like and what features it includes. So the main differences in civil military and military cultural approaches is this is a society question. If civil military thinkers require the existence of society, and military cultural scholars think it is not necessary because the unifying of everything and centralization and patriotism are much more important things, and they take different attitudes towards centralization of power. Is good from military cultural point of view and bad from civil military thinking, because it ruins the contract between society and army, and and it doesn't pay attention on civil society at all. Professionalization, as I told before, is also one of the theme that is considered in a different ways. It's quite different whether we talk about professionalization of army is not actual in authoritarian state, because authoritarian state is interested to make bigger, broader army and to build a link to citizens through propaganda and not by making professionals that could be independent. And so, conclusions. Civil-military relation ideas in their classic mode and version are not on the agenda today because transition to democracy didn't happen, and it turned back to Soviet-style rule, where the army is considered to be different. Rising patriotism is actually on the stage. Civil society is pushed backward, and the gap between society and army is actually growing, especially in case of Ukrainian war. The army wants more and more soldiers, and the society is at the moment quite tired of that, and we see we can notice it by the expressions of soldiers' wives and mothers that had been on media today. They require their soldiers and sons back, and also a rotation question, because soldiers that pushed to war are not allowed to come back to take a rest at home at all. But the army is interested to win the war at any cost, and that causes a great tension between army and people. And the president, although he has gathered all the power to his arms, he doesn't take any side of in this conflict, because there are elections coming. So maybe I'll finish with that, and if you have some questions, you are welcome. Here are some of my references, but not all. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Elisa, about this very, I think, important study. And it's very fascinating how confusing these concepts and terms are in Russia. And for me, it sounds like Russian state wants to kind of replace civil-military relations with military-civil relations. And I also thought how this military culture of society then differs from patriotism, for example, or patriotic education. And these are good questions to think about. And yeah, I think we also have to take all this into account when we research on civil-military relations in Russia, and really think, can we always use all the Western concepts, because obviously there's no soil for them in Russian society. And I think what unites this concept, Russian concept, is like the kind of one-way essence, where the civil society or individual is only an object for control. But let's have a couple of questions now, and then we can continue discussions after all three presentations. So please. Okay. Welcome. Would you like to come here, so okay. People on YouTube can...
Oh yeah, forgot about YouTube. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Lucjan Kubica. I'm from Hybrid Center of Excellence. You surprised me by one of your kind of conclusions at the end that, or maybe it's not surprising really, that Russia pushed back the civil society from the military and that the gap is widening. Hasn't the war in Ukraine changed anything? I mean, what we see in Ukraine and how Ukrainians are adapting society to filling the gaps, to delivering non-lethal equipment, food, whatever support they need, and we see how those two engines are working: this typical military structure and this civil society combining forces and doing a great job. And I thought that a bit Russia is kind of trying to mimic that, and I saw that there are truly volunteers coming to Donbass from Russia, delivering water, drones, etc. So there is something like that going on. So hasn't this changed this kind of civilian-military cooperation in Russia, or the scale is too small and you cannot compare it to what is happening in Ukraine? Have you have any insight in that? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And actually, the modern civil military experts, I have read texts by Kirill Shamiev, and he states that the war in Ukraine actually has created a crisis between Russian civil society and Russian military, because as I stated previously, army wants more and more soldiers. They don't let those soldiers back home, and the society is getting tired in this war. And if it goes on, the crisis will only get deeper, and this whole situation was not good at all, even before the war. And Russians didn't really want to serve in the army. Russians are quite recordsmen in finding a way to avoid conscriptions, and army was not popular even before, and today it's getting worse, and the situation, the conflict is rising, and Putin is maybe the figure that could take one side in this conflict, but he doesn't do that because he needs both, and every solution in this case is bad for him. If he chooses to please civil society, then army gets angry, and if he chooses to somehow provide more soldiers and to make army and military happier, then the civil society gets angry at him, and that's a very hard situation. Hopefully I answered on your question.
Maybe I can add to this point. I have studied patriotic education and new patriotic initiative in schools, and yeah, I agree that Russia kind of mimic voluntarism and support for the war, but what I have seen, it's more forced than real volunteer actors, or then they pay for students or offer stipends and things that you kind of, if you want to create a career in Russia, you must do something. To show support for the war. So I don't see like real grassroots volunteerism in Russia.
Even if you talk about support of previous wars, they were not They were not popular. The youngs didn't want to go to wars in Chechnya, for instance. I read many critical expressions about that.
All right. Do we have more questions? Okay, please. Would you? Yeah, come here. It's easier.
Okay. Thank you for a really interesting research topic. At least I think so. So I have maybe one personal comment because I happened to be in Moscow when the partial mobilization happened, and I could kind of confirm what Jonna just said about not being like there was this I think it was mainly state-led volunteer organization created. And they had this hashtag #MivMieste, and you had to. And I thought it was almost embarrassing sometimes for the Russian state because these volunteers, they were making like woolen socks for the people in the military. They were buying them equipment that the government wasn't. It was almost embarrassing that how the civil society was half forced, half kind of. Half just thinking about their boys in the front, giving them these. And then another point about the mobilization. I was slightly surprised at how I quickly understood that it was quite easy actually to avoid mobilization even if you were drafted. You could just stay at home. I know some people who stayed at home for 2 months because you had to be handed it personally. Or then you could pay a fine of about 500 euros or something like that. So many people chose that after the mobilization was officially ended. And I found it surprising that still people walked into the drafting office because they felt that especially as a man, my responsibility is to walk here, even though I feel that sometimes in Russian culture it was very important to kind of avoid any kind of burden that the state brings. You're almost proud if you can avoid these kind of state responsibilities, but still people felt that I'm a man, I have to walk into this drafting office. And I don't know if you've noticed it, but I have a question as well. I was wondering, have you studied, there was talk about ethnicity yesterday, because many of the drafted now Russian drafted in the Ukraine, there's proportionally more from minorities, from religious minorities and ethnic minorities. How do you see this? You mentioned the Orthodox Church. Is there any friction that you see?
Yes, there are some tensions because the people from the peripheries. Yes, the situation is completely different whether you are a young man from Moscow or St. Petersburg, or if you are a poor one from Russian village or some ethnic republic. And the one from it is stated that people from Moscow and bigger cities, they have better opportunities to avoid the war and avoid to get to such circumstances where they can get killed. They have more opportunities to avoid army, but in peripheries, people are poorer, and there are greater pressures for them to somehow get money, and this is a money question for the poorer ones. And the peripheries are poorer, and also the ethnic areas are also the poorer one, and there many the state and the power don't säästele. They want to throw they tend to throw a poorer and less protected civilians to the war rather than those who are richer and live in bigger cities. This is so at the moment.
Okay, let's move on to the next presentation. I just open it here. And our next panelist comes from National Defence Academy in Latvia, Ieva Beresina. Did I pronounce it? Well, we'll speak about the patriotic and nationalist orientations in Russian society. So we continue with concepts. And as we have seen, Russians understand and give different meanings for common words and concepts than we do. For example, they understand very differently democracy. And it is important to kind of all time update and make clear what Russians means with these words. And for example, in international arenas. Because different understanding of words leads to mutual misinterpretation. And words and concepts are also a means of warfare for Russia. That's why we must be aware of them. So Eva has examined patriotism and will now tell us what Russian patriotism actually means. You're welcome.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for a very kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here and to share my ideas. And I will start with a brief explanation of where I stand where I stand in terms of this topic. So first of all, I come from Latvia, which is a neighboring country of Russia, which is a small country. And when we speak about Russia's war against Ukraine, so Latvia is mentioned as one of the who will be the next in case Russia wins in Ukraine. So my perspective is from a small neighboring country being occupied by the Soviet Union, being part of Russian Empire, and being under increasing threat of Russia's potential expansion. So actually, the link to civil-military relations, in my case, it's a question about support of Russian society concerning Russian expansionism. It's not so directly on military, but it's indirectly. The second point that I wanted to clarify is that, as you can see, what I'm doing here, it is part of the project we do in Latvia, where we investigate patriotic and nationalist orientations in Latvia and how does it relate to democratic civil society. But since I'm also interested in Russia, so I use this lens and to look at the processes within Russia. And final comment is that what I will be presenting here is just a very, very initial stage of my research. I would call it exploratory research, where I try to understand I try to understand what is happening. And now I have to understand how I switch the slides. I believe I need to put it in presentation mode. Oh, is this one? How do I move the slides? I don't really. This one doesn't seem to be working. Yeah, no, it must.
Okay.
It must work with this one. Yeah, and also this is. To a large extent, what I will be presenting today is a continuation of the previous work I presented last year, and just briefly, then my interest was I was interested in Russian official discourse and the fact that they equalize nationalism with Nazism, that they use those concepts as interexchangeable. But at the end of this process, I came up with 10 strategic narratives on nationalism in Russian official discourse. And of course, and one thing I found that they really differentiate nationalism from patriotism, and also they are very critical towards nationalism. But this was Russian official discourse. So my next question was, but how does it play out in Russian society? So this is what my today's presentation will be. And briefly about why do I look at this problem, because of course this Russo-Ukraine war, it changes global security environment and architecture, and potentially it's very unstable. It may bring about certain changes within Russia, and and one might be. So at this stage, I pointed out like two possible development directions which concern security of neighboring countries. So one is like neo-imperialism scenarios that Russia wants to expand further, and the other one very idealistic, but still nevertheless possibly democratization scenario. If let's say if a regime gets destabilized, as one of the potential. And based on the premises of democratic peace theory, I assume that if Russia gets democratized, then it means less risks for neighboring countries, because democracies tend not to fight with each other, and also then within democratic countries, societies have more say when they don't want to go to war, which actually is not so much a case. In this what we experience now. Why I use both concepts? Because of course the academic literature tends to differentiate patriotism and nationalism, and the academic literature also tends to differentiate different types of patriotism and nationalism, and some are being defined as compatible to democratic values and sort of desirable and necessary, and some are risky because they may grow as a hatred and aggression towards other countries. But it's not. But it's rather simplistic point of view, because as we study trends within Latvian society, we can see that it's not so easy to distinguish patriotism and nationalism, because people may have actually both orientations, and also within both extremes of those concepts, you can experience this aggressive side. But also in the Russian context, in the way that they substitute those concepts, I think it really makes sense to look at both of them, and especially because within Russian official discourse, you can find these lines that they really. Interestingly enough, in line with Western academic tradition, Vladimir Putin distinguishes nationalism as a hatred of other peoples and patriotism as a love of one's motherland. But as I said, it's pretty simplistic view. So again, as a starting point, how to understand what is going on in Russian society? So I decided that I will focus on two dimensions. One is in terms of values. So to what extent Russian society leans towards democratic or authoritarian values, because also in the analysis of those concepts, patriotism and nationalism, you differentiate how it plays out in democratic and authoritarian societies. And then it's the civic-ethnic dichotomy where we can refer to Kant's basic works, but what determines belonging to a nation? Either it is an ethnic principle or civic principle. So I end up with like 4 segments at now, and I try to put in some elements which characterizes Russian society and which at least to me helps to understand. So one, a very idealistic and rarely happening, so that civic belonging to a nation and democratic value orientation. So this is civic forms of nationalism and patriotism, and actually we do not speak about it in the Russian context, but theoretically this is something where we might strive. Then on the democratic and ethnic side, there is an ethno-nationalism, and I think it is important both concerning the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it was largely ethnic and democratic movement. It combined both those elements, and also in today's context, when we speak about the potential future scenarios of Russia, one of perspectives is that potentially Russia might collapse along ethnic lines, and also in the previous presentation we heard this point that the ethnic minorities are more being employed into the warfare, and it may raise some conflicts. Then also on this civic and authoritarian, there is really this past dependency and past influence on today's Russia, and I think also it's interesting to look at the Soviet patriotism, which officially, which theoretically was civic, and it aimed to be trans-ethnic. Aiming to establish this Soviet identity, but in fact, as Bankhorn defines, it was pretty much Soviet imperial nationalism. But what I find really interesting and ways to dig further, it's where authoritarian values and ethnic orientations merge, and one is right-wing nationalism, which was present in Russia, but I will talk about it later. But also civilizational nationalism, and this civilizational perspective seems rather interesting and explanatory to me. I will not stay here because I basically explain it. So what I have done so far, and like I said, this is really exploratory research, and as we know that Russian society is becoming, Russian state has become increasingly oppressive, so it is also more problematic to trust sociological data from Russia, and it's increasingly difficult to understand what's going on in Russian society. So I decided to look further back into recent history. Mainly I focused till 2013, before Russia annexed Crimea, because after that gradually it became more and more strict, and I tried to look at some secondary data, mainly quantitative, but also as I continue my study, I found also excellent qualitative studies explaining some trends within Russian society. So so this is just some. So I will share with you some of the data. I hope you will find them interesting, albeit they are old and secondary data. So first of all, I will show you some democracy authoritarianism indicators, and first of all I looked at ISSP research on national identities, and they had 3 waves of studies, and to put Russia into a comparative context, I choose 3 countries that were also measured in all 3 waves, and 2 of them are Eastern European, and one of course is Latvia. That's why I was pretty interested in. But I took also Norway as a Nordic country and a robust democracy, just to see this comparative perspective. And theory, if you look at theoretical papers, one of the questions that identify this right-wing, more authoritarian approaches, nationalist approaches. So one of the questions is that the world would be a better place if people from other countries were more like in my country. And we see that this trend has grown in Russia. And in this case, Norway is interesting because you see it's quite low. But there is another question I didn't include in the presentation, but the question was, do you consider that my country is one of the best countries in the world? And Norwegians were really high on this one. But at the same time, they don't have these expectations that everyone should be like Norwegians. So we can see some authoritarian trends in this one. Then another graph that I found in Levada, which speaks about, so are Russians the same as other nations, or are Russians a great nation with a special significance in world history? And what I found interesting is that just briefly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, like 80% of Russians considered being the same as other nations, but within 10-year time it changed, and it was even before Putin came to power. So this is this is again one of the interesting trends. Another indicator of authoritarianism within national identity study is this: my country right or wrong? Do you agree or disagree? Because democratic approach presumes that you can be constructively critical to make your society better. And here we can see, that constantly already from 90s, like more than half of Russian society has this stance. So to conclude, we can see definitely certain authoritarian trends within Russian society. Then when some of the civic ethnic indicators, and one of the questions being measured in Russia on a regular basis and by different sociological companies and projects. So what do you think about the idea of Russia for Russians? So this main graph is by Levada Center, and generally we can see that more than half of Russian society tend to support this idea. If we combine the answers, I support, it is a high time to implement, and it would be nice to implement, but with reasonable limits. But we can see that this trend has a little bit decreased, and I would argue that this has to do something with government policies. And 2014 Neurus survey had a similar question, and here we can see that more than half of Russian society at that time agreed to the statement. And then also Neurus study gives us some insights. They included a question, so when people say Russia for Russians, so what do you mean by that? And we can see that there is only Russians by nationality, and this decreased from 2013 to 2014. Mostly Russians by nationality, but not only them, so this increased. So there is some trend towards civic nationalism, and also all citizens of the Russian Federation, regardless of nationality. So you see some ethno-nationalism, but also certain trends towards civic nationalism. But then there is another question concerning teaching of primary school subjects, not only in Russian but also in the languages of those nationalities that live in the area, and we can see that majority of Russian society doesn't support this idea. And this is quite interesting in the context of Latvia as a neighboring country, because when we want in our country our school to be taught only in the national language, then it is a huge problem for Russia, and then they bring up this issue of discrimination of Russian ethnic minorities. So it's really hypocrisy in a way. But what is interesting, so albeit we see those ethno-nationalism trends within Russian society, consequently Putin has opposed it, and you can find the quotes in 2003 and in 2021 that ethno-nationalism and this idea Russia for Russians, that this is not a good idea, and I would claim that this is really concern of the potential collapse of the Russian federation avoidance of this ethno-nationalism. But then I included also several indicators that might characterize this civilizational nationalism, and I think this clash of civilization perspectives, it really might be one of the lenses that could explain what's going on and how Russia builds its relations with neighboring countries and the rest of the world. And from several presentations, we heard concerning Europe, Asia, and Euro-Asia. And so Neurus surveys give us an answer to the question, so do you consider Russia part of European civilization and something else? And we can see that majority, 1/3, are of opinion that Russia is a separate civilization. Less similar number also considers that Russia is a mixture of European and Asian civilization, and less than 20, around 20%, which is a really small number, considers that Russia is a part of European civilization. Finally, the personal belonging to certain civilization type, we can see that most of Russian societies primarily identify with Orthodox civilization, and then the next is European civilization, and less to Eurasian civilization, and even less so with Islamic civilization. And finally, also, Neurus survey gives us an idea of what is the support for a certain expansionism trends. And interestingly enough, that after Russia annexed Crimea in 2013, number of those who think that Russia should stay in the borders it is increased. But still there are certain views that borders of Russia should be changed by including former USSR, former members of USSR inhabited by Slavic people, and also some things that it should be like the former USSR, and smaller number would be ready also to leave North Caucasus. So we can see that already 10 years ago there was this expansionist trends, and some conclusions at this moment. So what we see that in Russian official discourse, they substitute the concept nationalism with that of patriotism, which Russia implements in an authoritarian and expansionist manner. And also we see the long-term trends that Russian governing elite has suppressed and co-opted right-wing nationalism, which happened at about the time of 2011-2012, after real protests against re-election of Russian Putin in his third presidential term. And they have strengthened this civilizational nationalism under the label of patriotism. To some extent, patriotic and nationalist orientations of Russian society support civilizational nationalism, as it tends to support authoritarian values and ethnic aspects of national belonging and expansionism. And finally, I think it is really essential to unpack the meaning of patriotism and nationalism as it is used in the context of Russia, because they may be misleading and manipulative when Russian officials exploit those concepts in the Western discourse and particularly in relation to neighboring countries. Yes. So thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, that's my message.
Okay, thank you, Eva. We saw some mind-blowing statistics, and I've also seen in my work how patriotism has changed toward more to the defense of the motherland instead of love for the motherland. And now we saw how this militant patriotism also include this kind of very nationalistic characteristics. And yeah, I think this was also a strong example why this war is not only Putin's war. And unfortunately, I think in this soil, the democracy may be a very distant dream. And I also thought, is this substitution, has it happened on purpose, or intentionally, or is it some kind of natural development and unconscious progress? But I don't know, maybe you have some ideas on that, but I open the floor for the questions, and yeah, please.
So thank you very much, Eva. Very interesting. I would like to include other factor for thinking and discussion. That this is the demographic evolution in Russia. During the last decades, we have seen how the growth of some ethnicities is different from others. You know, the mortality rate, for example, for Slavic Russians is higher. The birth rate is higher for other ethnic groups. Plus migration that is coming mainly from Central Asia to balance sometimes the demographic situation. Plus the Russians who are going abroad are mainly Slavic also. So how do you think that this demographic evolution and also the increase of the percentage of other ethnicities, I'm referring mainly to Muslim people, can affect, you know, the internal relation of the different ethnic groups in Russia? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's very good question and interesting, and and to start to go to give precise answers, my internal question concerning this and also previous topics is, does it really matter what's going on in Russian society? Because, for example, when you speak about demographics, Russian political scientist Ekaterina Shulman, she used to say that demographically Russian society is dominated, it's female-dominated and aging female. And this is a society that usually doesn't attack neighbors. But we see the reality is different. Also, when it comes to demographic changes and, for example, migrants coming in, a new Islamic religious building being built in Moscow and certain, and also the role of a Chechen leader in Chechen, and also increasing dependency of China, I would put also into this one. So how it will play out, because those trends sort of differ from this official discourse, but But my feeling is that, due to this growing totalitarianism, at this moment it really doesn't matter. It is what Russian officials decide it to be, and it is the way how they construct it to be. But on the other hand, in some it may play out in very unpredictable manner. I think so. It has lots of risks in case if this state power machine, this oppressive machine, somehow starts to crack, then it becomes really unpredictable. But for now, we see protests going up, and then Bashkortostan, and but nothing happens. Yeah. So. Yeah. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Olga Milyoshina. I'm from Military Institute of Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev, and I have a question to Yeva. Your speech was very interesting for me. I have my master's degree in this case. And have you heard anything about the new terms that appeared not so long? With the beginning of new phase of war in Ukraine in 2022, it's Russian fascism. And in Ukraine, some researchers use this term. And I want to know your opinion about this. And can we name actions and in regime in Russia like fascism, Russian fascism, Russism, and also I want to know, maybe you discover the ideology of Russian world, Ruski Mir, and do you see a threat in this ideology to European security?
Yeah, thank you very much. Sure, I have heard of this idea of Russism, and I think it is like officially confirmed in Ukrainian parliament, which basically means that Russia practices a specific form of Nazism, which is specific in the Russian context, and emotional. I haven't studied it academically. Emotionally, I support this idea pretty much, but well, to be academically precise. But why I think why we need to find a different name for describing what is going on in Russia, in my view, is because what is specific to Russia is that they pursue like really aggressive nationalism, but they don't do it in a direct way, as it was in the case of Nazism as we know it in history. But they kind of subvert it. They hide it under the title of fighting against Nazism, being, and I think this is really tricky, and that's why I have this point. We need to unpack those concepts and we need to explain it, because and I think this is something what we as neighboring countries of Russia, it's really a problem for us, because when we have this Western discourse which is critical towards nationalism, largely because of World War II experience in Nazi Germany. So when they criticize nationalism, it largely resonates towards being in the West. So we being on the borders with Russia, so we have we need to really explain that it is aggressive, it is dangerous, and it is specific approach in terms how they communicate it. Yeah, so this is very interesting. And Russian world, yes, I touched upon a Russian world in this defining Russian strategic narratives, and I would say yes, of course, it is dangerous things, because this ideology of neo-imperialism, I would say, and wherever they attempt to promote Russian language, culture, unfortunately, it comes with risks to security. Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much, and let's move on. Our next panelist is Olga Eloshina from the Military Institute of Taras Shevchenko, Kyiv National University. And Olga is also the officer of the armed forces of Ukraine. She will tell and show us how Russia manages its so-called civil-military relations in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And I think in this point we can use the term military-civil relations, as Elisa brought up. So you're welcome. Sorry, I just forgot to put this.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Olga Miloshina, a senior lieutenant of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. I'm finishing my master's degree in military political science at the Military Institute of Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv. I'm extremely pleased to have the opportunity to speak before you today because it's important for my country and for me to speak and to take part in this seminar, to express my vision of certain terrible actions of the Russian Federation in relation to Ukraine. My topic is features of Russia's development of civil-military relations in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And before I start, I want to recommend you and some advice. If you want to use your device, and you can find the website Deep State Map. In Ukraine, you can see some interactive map, Ukrainian front line, and you can see about what territories I will talk about. It's a site Deep State map, and you can see the temporary occupied territories and some information about front line. So. Today, the Russian Federation pays special attention to the development of the civil-military relations in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. It's Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia regions, and the Autonomous Republic of the Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Russia is doing everything to unleash the support of civilians, because in addition to the territory, they occupied their population. And I think that capturing human consciousness is as difficult as taking an enemy trench. That is why Russian Federation is trying to keep territories not only by armed means, but also by ideological means. The occupying power pays special attention to education, culture, language, religion, holding fiction elections, and influence through the media. And today I want to focus one of them. First step which Russia do in the temporarily occupied territories of our country, it was confiscation of Ukrainian literature. Most often literature about the Holodomor in Ukraine, Ukrainian revolutions, especially Revolution of Dignity 2013-2014, anti-terrorist operation in the east of our country 2014-2018, joint force operation from 2014 to February 22, educational aids, methodical materials, reference books on the history of Ukraine, as well as works of fictions by famous Ukrainian writers and poets fall under the ban and confiscation. And so Russia is trying to cross out the past of Ukrainian territories, and they see literature as a great threat to its complete occupation. In particular, cases of mass burning of Ukrainian literature in local boiler rooms have been recorded in Helsinki, Lugansk region. Lugansk region is temporary occupied territory, some part. So, the next is education. Education acts as an instrument of soft power in relation to preschoolers, school children, and students. The Russian Federation is changing educational curricula in the temporary occupied territories. Ukrainian children are forced to study Russian language and literature, history of Russia, the Donetsk People Republic, the history of the Lugansk People Republic, lessons of citizenship of Donbass. So this course is divided into 3 areas: Donbass, my native land, raising yourself in the citizens of the Donetsk People Republic, and Donbass and the Russian world, or Donbass и русский мир. In the next slide, you can see some examples of notebooks which Russia supplies to the temporary occupied territories. And on the left page, we see Anthem of the Russian Federation. On the right page is the Anthem of the Lugansk People Republic. And I want to pay attention that it's just a book for children, just notebook when the children make their notes every day. Every day, children open their books and make some tasks for their homework or something else. And every day, they see Putin and portraits of the President of the Russian Federation and the illegal occupation head of the temporary occupied Lugansk region. They also created the history of the illegal creation of so-called Lugansk people and wrote it in this notebook. So, the Russian Federation occupation media, the media, informs that on December 2023, the Russians brought more than 160,000 copies of Russian textbooks to the temporary occupied territories of Zaporizhia region. It's one region, and every region have the same influence by Russia. And as we all understand, it's money. Every book has a certain price. And the Russia invests crazy money in this area just to attract, to support their population, civilians. And the next is the most awful for me is militarization of young generation. In Russia, a totalitarian system of brainwashing and militarization of the young generation has been created through the organization Юнармия, Молодая Республика, Молодая Гвардия, as well as a centralized system of the child education, which is designed to rise in children in the cult of Russian war. For example, as of December 2023, the occupiers have created more than 20 pro-Russian young organizations on the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine. More than 6,000 events were held in 2023. There were humanitarian missions, Russian patriotic actions, participation in all Russian projects, creative events, pro-Russian. Due to so-called patriotic work, Russia actively carry out systematic measures to destroy Ukrainian identity, national identity among children, which contradicts numerous articles of the UN Convention on the Right of the Child. Such action of the Russia are a directed violation of the right to cultural and national identity. This contradicts the provision of Article 29 of the UN Convention on the Right of the Child, which stipulates that the child's education should be aimed at fostering respect for cultural identity, language, and national values, preparing children for a conscious life in a free society, in understanding the most important peace and tolerance. Forward to the past, I called this slide. Forward to the past, this is how you can describe the promotion of ideology in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine. Russia actively promotes the heroic deeds of Soviet Union during the Second World War through the billboards, newspapers, and postcards. Russia's manipulation of historical memory, as well as attempt to interpret current events through the prism of ideas inherited from the Soviet Union about Second World War. But it's not a random actions. This is a component of a general strategy aimed at restoring the status of Russia as a great power and world leader, spreading and rooting the ideas of Russian world and Ruski Mir. You can see some banners on the temporary occupied city of Melitopol in the Zaporizhia regions. Russia installed these banners, posters about the heroes of the Soviet Union in this city. Also, we have some fact about some events which were in October 2023. The Russia restored the tank T-70, which stood on a pedestal in the city of Melitopol, held events on the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the city from the fascist invaders. The restored tank drove through the streets of the city. I consider that Russia subconsciously refers to its past achievements in history because it doesn't have a happy present and future. And using some past victories, they try to maintain stability in their own state and distract from the real problem of their country. Because what Russia brings to temporary occupied territories brings only death, fear, and blood for our civilians. So, also the next step is also very interesting, but in this case of topic, the occupiers conduct a legal election to the local occupation administration, appoint so-called heads of the occupied region, establish an administrative system, and force the population to obey the laws of the Russian Federation. For example, on September 2023, Russia directed pseudo-elections to the so-called local authorities ended in the occupied territories of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia regions. The fake vote lasted approximately 2 weeks, and Putin's party won as expected. The picture invented by the Russian of the national support and the benefit of joyful life under the occupation is impossible without media coverage. In connection with this, the networks of propaganda institution became an indispensable attribute of the occupation administration. And I have an example. Unfortunately, this is not this presentation, but I have a newspaper Novorossiya, which was published to the temporary occupied territories of Donetsk region. It was issue of the newspaper dated February 8, 2024, and the title of this newspaper was "Either Cut or Euthanize." And I read you some quotes from this newspaper. It was 8 February this year, and what they wrote. It's quote from this newspaper. It's not my opinion, it's quote. There are no more options left. Either kill or put to sleep, because this zombie state, Ukraine, they called Ukraine zombie state, will poison us Russians too. The next quote. There are no options in Russia without a confident and uncompromising victory, the complete defeat of Ukrainian nationalism, and the further cleaning of the liberated territories from manifestation of Ukrainian demonism, as the current Germans will atone for the guilt of the past. Future Ukrainians will have to renounce everything that was born from Mazepa to nowadays. And it was only in the first 2 pages. Pages of this newspaper has no clear news. Newspaper is for news, not for propaganda, but in Russia, it's only their pro-Russian reflection of the future of Ukraine. Also, unfortunately, I haven't slide about it, but I will talk, and in the temporary occupied territories, Russia persecutes civilians who have some relatives in the armed forces of Ukraine and who took part in some revolutions of dignity or have some pro-Ukrainian opposition, and we have a lot of examples and evidence about violence and killing civilians. Everybody knows about Bucha, Irpin, Demidov, Gorodnya, it's Chernihiv region, also Kherson. We know a lot of facts about violence of this country in the temporary to our civilians, and also they mobilize our people to their army in temporary occupied territories. They forced Ukrainian man who is in the temporary occupied territories to join to Russian army. It's awful things, and people need to hide from Russians. Also, Russia forcing people to get Russian passports in the temporary ID passports. Without a passport, people can't go to the hospital, get a certificate in school or diploma in university. They need Russian passport, and also they forced to change Russian license plates in cars. People have to confirm their right to their property after replacing with a Russian passport. On the last slide, you can see a local resident of the city of Kherson who in the first day of the occupation tore down Russian billboards with the title, "Russia is here forever." And I think that this Kherson man is the personification of the people who, despite everything, continue wait for liberation from Russia invaders. After occupying territories, Russia purposefully destroys active people in order to break the ability of local communities to self-organize. Neither the Russian ballot nor Dostoevsky philosophy can prevent Russia from committing atrocities. On the contrary, Russian culture is used as a weapon to dominate and destroy other culture. This statement shows a genocidal intention to destroy all dissenters. It's no coincidence that Russian tanks appear first, and then banners with the title "Russia is here forever." This is a kind of signposts with which Russia marks the occupied territories using these banners. And during the occupation, the Ukrainian language and symbols are banned. The state ideology of the Kremlin is taught under the guise of the history. The state religion is established in the form of Moscow Patriarchate, and in classrooms once filled with the melodies of Ukrainian literature and the poetry of our country, now forcibly replaced the propagandist narratives of the invaders, masquerading as history. Russia understood that to destroy a certain national group, it's not necessary to call its all representatives. You can forcibly change their identity and the entire nation will disappear. And despite everything, I'm sure that free and strong Ukrainian people will continue to return our homes and territories, because for us, our people, it's our wealth. And glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes of Ukraine, and thank you for your attention. Questions now or later?
Maybe now. Don't move so far. Okay, thank you, Oha. I think what happens in these territories is disgusting and deeply sad. And this is indoctrination and this is genocide. I have studied patriotic education in Russian schools after the beginning of the war, and I can say they use these same methods also on their own population, especially children whose state needs to support the war. But so the concept is quite the same in Russia, but of course Russians don't have to Russificate and turn their own people. And this is so much more intense in these territories. And I think it would be great to study more about the differences and similarities and who is organizing this all. But I have also studied resistance in Russia and read a couple of papers also about the resistance in these territories towards this patriotic indoctrination. And what I can say is that the resistance is as different as night and a day in Russia and Ukraine. And Ukrainians have resisted a lot, even they face so much more terror and torture. And this has led me to the very deep questions about the human nature and how some people resist and are so brave, while others act like cheats. When facing authoritarian power they do not like. And I would like to ask you, or can you tell a little bit more about the resistance? And which are the ways people, how they resist, how they can resist in these conditions? And also, this is maybe a painful question, but what do you think, how well this goes to the children and like a young generation, Ukrainian? How well this kind of propaganda goes? Yeah, how this affects. Okay. And then we can have questions.
So what about resistance? I know the facts, and maybe somebody knows about a movement in the temporary occupied territories. It's Yellow Ribbon. It's people who is on the temporary occupied territories. They, it's not violence resistance. They just spread some postcards with pro-Ukrainian position around the different cities. For Russians see these pro-Ukrainian postcards as something else. Also, they spread yellow stripes like a symbol of resistance, and Russia understood it. And also a lot of facts about help Ukrainian in the temporary occupied territories. They help Ukrainian. Give up some information from temporary occupied territories. I think everybody knows that some brave people share and try to find information and to help forces of Ukraine. And resistant people is waiting. People waiting for Ukrainian army. Of course, I have a lot of friends who has their relatives in the temporary occupied territories. They are scared. They're just waiting because Russian military is just very crazy and violent people, and that's why they must be calm and just waiting for our armed forces. So what about influence to the young generation? It's very strong influence because it's not only about school. I saw some pictures from kindergarten, children garden, where 3 years old girl or boy with a uniform like to some events in for example, for New Year or Christmas. It's very strange and awful. And what people need to do, children must develop. They can't just sit at home, unfortunately. And Russia, unfortunately, forced them to do it. It's not their own feelings, and parents also understand it. But we hope that Ukrainian army do everything to return our territories and our peoples, and I think we will do it soon.
Thank you. Okay, please.
Thank you, Olya, for the great talk and bringing to attention to all of us, I guess, the realities, the sad realities. So, my question is about the challenges that lie ahead. So you mentioned, Ukrainians are waiting for the armed forces to come liberate these temporary occupied territories. And I'm just thinking of once they're liberated, the extent, the magnitude of the challenge that begins at that point in terms of rehabilitation. So as an example, can you tell us maybe about some of the lessons that you have learned from looking at parts of, say, Kherson being liberated after 10, 11 months of occupation versus what the challenge is going to be when Crimea is liberated? And now that's, dealing with children, for example, who have spent much of their formative years under such a Russian occupation. And what exactly would that mean? And is Ukraine preparing itself with the right infrastructure, organizations, etc., and partnerships with the West to be able to deal with those challenges, to essentially rehabilitate and undo what Russia is trying to force on Ukrainians now?
Thanks for your question. It's really interesting and complicated, I think, because we need time to have our territories to our country again. But I think it must be solved. When we return our territories and our people, we need to just show them the real consequences which Russia do in our territory, and to show what they did, because Russia propaganda is very strong, and just sometimes Ukrainian can't see fresh information from Ukrainian. They only in this type of frame. They don't know anything about what is in Ukraine, because Russia banned some Ukrainian sites, some websites, Telegram channels, and something else. And it's important to have some events to people, to like some I saw it in this case, some presentation, but it mustn't be like forcing, like to force something to do. It must be accurate, because people who living in this territory, they were scared, really, and we need to support and to understand them despite everything. What about Crimea and previous occupied territories to 2022? It's also complicated questions. I only hope for the occupation, and I'm doing everything to have I and my colleagues and every in Ukrainian trying to do everything in our situation. And after the occupation, when the time will come, we will be thinking about. But I think that some people and some representatives do it now. I don't I'm not a specialist in this topic.
Thank you. Do we have more questions?
Yep, thank you.
What about some questions for another presentators? Okay, thank you everybody. I think this was very topical and interesting, and it was a good starting point to start civil-military project here at the National Defence University, and we saw how many various topics we can have in this disciplinary. I think now we have also an extra hour to network with each others, and let's continue discussions here. And we have a lunch at 1, I think, maybe a little bit in advance. Okay, thank you very much. Okay.